No one in that courtroom expected Jasmine Crockett to stay silent after the slap. It happened during a closed juvenile hearing. 14-year-old Malik Bell, black, no attorney, no parent present. The room wasn't full, just a few court staff, a judge, and 3 quiet students observing from the back row. Then came Dana Whitmore, a decorated female police lieutenant with over 20 years on the force. She walked straight down the aisle and struck Jasmine across the face. No warning, no words. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even touch her cheek. She simply stood still, back straight, chin lifted, eyes locked on the woman who hit her. And in that stillness, the balance of power shifted. That moment didn't begin a scandal. It exposed a system. Because when the ones trained to stay quiet finally decide to speak, it's not noise they make, it's history. There was no mention of the hearing in the morning docket, no press alert, no public listing. It was a quiet session, a juvenile case scheduled for 3:10 p.m. in a side courtroom at the Dallas County Courthouse. The kind that runs under radar, out of view, and under the justification of protecting the minor's privacy. But Jasmine Crockett knew better. She arrived without staff, without a briefcase, without the usual air of political business. She wore a soft gray blazer, plain black slacks, and a pair of flats that had seen too many hallways. Her hair was tied back. Her stride was unhurried. The only thing she carried was a thin file and a firm memory. Her memory of Marcus, her younger brother, gone before Jasmine had ever made it to law school. Gone because the system said resisting arrest when he hadn't even spoken. Gone because no video existed, and the only witnesses were 2 officers and a redacted page. Jasmine had learned the hard way that injustice often begins where no one is watching, and today she had been told someone needed to watch. A message had come to her private line just 12 hours earlier from an old colleague at a nonprofit legal clinic. Name is Malik Bell, 14, arrested outside a convenience store. No guardian informed, no legal representation. They're running it through Dana's team. That last line was all Jasmine needed to hear. Dana Whitmore, lieutenant, 23 years in the Dallas Police Department, publicly praised for restoring order in school zones, quietly feared for her special intervention unit that bypassed standard procedure. Jasmine had crossed paths with Dana once before, not in court, but during an education funding hearing, when Jasmine pushed for transparency around school police partnerships. Dana hadn't spoken, but the way she looked at Jasmine across that committee table, that look never left Jasmine's memory. It was the look of someone who didn't fear rules, because she had learned how to bend them in plain sight. So Jasmine walked into courtroom 2F that day not to speak, not to intervene, just to observe. But sometimes observation is the most threatening act a system can face. The room was dim, the wooden benches were scratched with time. The air smelled like paper, dust, and the faint bitterness of burnt coffee. There were no reporters, no bail bond agents, just 3 students in the back, a clerk with slow fingers, and a tired-looking judge reviewing his folder. Malik Bell was not in the courtroom proper. He was seated in an adjacent side room, visible only through a security glass panel. He wore a school hoodie and sat low in the chair, legs swinging slowly above the floor. His hands were cuffed, though no one had mentioned danger or violence. There was no lawyer beside him, not even a social worker. Then Jasmine saw her, Dana Whitmore, not in uniform but in tactical black, badge clipped to her belt. She stood near the prosecutor's table, arms crossed, gaze scanning the room. Their eyes met. Dana stiffened, and then, without a word, she began walking toward Jasmine. The air changed. The clerk looked up. Even the judge hesitated, unsure if something was wrong. Dana didn't stop. She stepped right up to Jasmine's row, stared directly at her, and with no warning, struck her across the face with an open hand. A sharp, fast sound. Skin on skin, the room stopped breathing. Jasmine didn't fall. She didn't raise a hand to her cheek. She didn't speak. She simply looked back at Dana, calm, clear-eyed, unblinking. And in that one gaze, the entire courtroom suddenly understood. This wasn't about one slap. It was about everything the slap was meant to silence. There was no mention of the hearing in the morning docket, no press alert, no public listing. It was a quiet session, a juvenile case scheduled for 3:10 p.m. in a side courtroom at the Dallas County Courthouse. The kind that runs under radar, out of view, and under the justification of protecting the minor's privacy. But Jasmine Crockett knew better. She arrived without staff, without a briefcase, without the usual air of political business. She wore a soft gray blazer, plain black slacks, and a pair of flats that had seen too many hallways. Her hair was tied back, her stride was unhurried. The only thing she carried was a thin file and a firm memory, her memory of Marcus, her younger brother, gone before Jasmine had ever made it to law school. Gone because the system said resisting arrest when he hadn't even spoken. Gone because no video existed, and the only witnesses were two officers and a redacted page. Jasmine had learned the hard way that injustice often begins where no one is watching. And today she had been told someone needed to watch. A message had come to her private line just 12 hours earlier from an old colleague at a nonprofit legal clinic. Name is Malik Bell, 14, arrested outside a convenience store. No guardian informed. No legal representation. They're running it through Dana's team. That last line was all Jasmine needed to hear. Dana Whitmore, lieutenant, 23 years in the Dallas Police Department, publicly praised for restoring order in school zones, quietly feared for her special intervention unit that bypassed standard procedure. Jasmine had crossed paths with Dana once before, not in court, but during an education funding hearing, when Jasmine pushed for transparency around school-police partnerships. Dana hadn't spoken, but the way she looked at Jasmine across that committee table, that look never left Jasmine's memory. It was the look of someone who didn't fear rules, because she had learned how to bend them in plain sight. So Jasmine walked into courtroom 2F that day not to speak, not to intervene, just to observe. But sometimes observation is the most threatening act a system can face. The room was dim, the wooden benches were scratched with time, the air smelled like paper, dust, and the faint bitterness of burnt coffee. There were no reporters, no bail bond agents, just 3 students in the back, a clerk with slow fingers, and a tired-looking judge reviewing his folder. Malik Bell was not in the courtroom proper. He was seated in an adjacent side room, visible only through a security glass panel. He wore a school hoodie and sat low in the chair, legs swinging slowly above the floor. His hands were cuffed, though no one had mentioned danger or violence. There was no lawyer beside him, not even a social worker. Then Jasmine saw her, Dana Whitmore, not in uniform, but in tactical black, badge clipped to her belt. She stood near the prosecutor's table, arms crossed, gaze scanning the room. Their eyes met. Dana stiffened, and then, without a word, she began walking toward Jasmine. The air changed. The clerk looked up. Even the judge hesitated, unsure if something was wrong. Dana didn't stop. She stepped right up to Jasmine's row, stared directly at her, and with no warning, struck her across the face with an open hand. A sharp, fast sound, skin on skin. The room stopped breathing. Jasmine didn't fall. She didn't raise a hand to her cheek. She didn't speak. She simply looked back at Dana, calm, clear-eyed, unblinking. And in that one gaze, the entire courtroom suddenly understood. This wasn't about one slap. It was about everything the slap was meant to silence. There was no mention of the hearing in the morning docket, no press alert, no public listing. It was a quiet session, a juvenile case scheduled for 3:10 p.m. in a side courtroom at the Dallas County Courthouse, the kind that runs under radar, out of view, and under the justification of protecting the minor's privacy. But Jasmine Crockett knew better. She arrived without staff, without a briefcase, without the usual air of political business. She wore a soft gray blazer, plain black slacks, and a pair of flats that had seen too many hallways. Her hair was tied back. Her stride was unhurried. The only thing she carried was a thin file and a firm memory, her memory of Marcus, her younger brother, gone before Jasmine had ever made it to law school. Gone because the system said resisting arrest when he hadn't even spoken. Gone because no video existed, and the only witnesses were 2 officers and a redacted page. Jasmine had learned the hard way that injustice often begins where no one is watching, and today she had been told someone needed to watch. A message had come to her private line just 12 hours earlier from an old colleague at a nonprofit legal clinic. Name is Malik Bell, 14, arrested outside a convenience store, no guardian informed, no legal representation. They're running it through Dana's team. That last line was all Jasmine needed to hear. Dana Whitmore, lieutenant, 23 years in the Dallas Police Department, publicly praised for restoring order in school zones, quietly feared for her special intervention unit that bypassed standard procedure. Jasmine had crossed paths with Dana once before, not in court, but during an education funding hearing, when Jasmine pushed for transparency around school police partnerships. Dana hadn't spoken, but the way she looked at Jasmine across that committee table, that look never left Jasmine's memory. It was the look of someone who didn't fear rules, because she had learned how to bend them in plain sight. So Jasmine walked into courtroom 2F that day not to speak, not to intervene, just to observe. But sometimes observation is the most threatening act a system can face. The room was dim, the wooden benches were scratched with time, the air smelled like paper, dust, and the faint bitterness of burnt coffee. There were no reporters, no bail bond agents, just 3 students in the back, a clerk with slow fingers, and a tired-looking judge reviewing his folder. Malik Bell was not in the courtroom proper. He was seated in an adjacent side room, visible only through a security glass panel. He wore a school hoodie and sat low in the chair, legs swinging slowly above the floor. His hands were cuffed, though no one had mentioned danger or violence. There was no lawyer beside him, not even a social worker. Then Jasmine saw her, Dana Whitmore, not in uniform but in tactical black, badge clipped to her belt. She stood near the prosecutors at table, arms crossed, gaze scanning the room. Their eyes met. Dana stiffened, and then without a word she began walking toward Jasmine. The air changed, the clerk looked up, even the judge hesitated, unsure if something was wrong. Dana didn't stop. She stepped right up to Jasmine's row, stared directly at her, and with no warning, struck her across the face with an open hand. A sharp, fast sound. Skin on skin, the room stopped breathing. Jasmine didn't fall. She didn't raise a hand to her cheek. She didn't speak. She simply looked back at Dana, calm, clear-eyed, unblinking. And in that one gaze, the entire courtroom suddenly understood. This wasn't about one slap. It was about everything the slap was meant to silence. The slap echoed for less than a second, but the silence that followed, that lasted much longer. The judge froze mid-sentence. A pen dropped from the clerk's hand and rolled off the desk. A young bailiff near the door swallowed hard and looked away. Jasmine Crockett didn't. She kept her gaze firmly on Dana Whitmore. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood in the center of that small courtroom like a column of granite. For the next 4 minutes, no one said a word. No one came to Jasmine's aid. No reprimand, no apology. The room, a place where justice was supposedly performed, had forgotten how to function without a script. It wasn't just the slap that shook them. It was the fact that Jasmine refused to play her assigned part. She wasn't outraged. She wasn't loud. She wasn't even emotional. And that made people uncomfortable in a way they couldn't explain. Jasmine didn't come to the hearing that day as a politician. She wore no name tag. No camera followed her ears. She didn't bring an aide or a microphone. She came with a thin folder and a deeper reason. She had received a quiet message, just a brief call from a former colleague. There's a boy being processed through back channels. No lawyer, no parent, no paperwork yet. Might want to look into it. She was used to whispers like that. Her background in civil rights law had taught her long ago that when something goes quiet, that's when it's most dangerous. So she sat in that courtroom not as a public figure, but as someone who'd lost a sibling to a process that left no mark, no bruise, no file anyone could trace. That's why she noticed what most others wouldn't. The courtroom layout was off. The boy, Malik Bell, was visible only through a small window in a side room. He wasn't seated with a defender. He wasn't even facing the judge. He was alone, legs swinging under a metal chair, hands loosely cuffed. No one in the room seemed to think that was odd. And then there was Lieutenant Dana Whitmore. Jasmine recognized the type long before she remembered the name. Uniform perfect, posture stiff, eyes always scanning for control, not safety. When Whitmore noticed Jasmine's presence, something flickered across her face. Not fear, not surprise, recognition. She knew Jasmine was a threat, not because she'd spoken, but because she was watching. That's what triggered her. She hadn't expected someone like Jasmine to be in a room like that. Quiet, still, uninvited. And that's when she slapped her. But she miscalculated. Jasmine had spent most of her adult life staring into faces that tried to silence her. She knew exactly what to do when power tried to show itself through force. She did nothing. Because silence used correctly doesn't mean submission. It means you no longer control what happens next. That night, Jasmine didn't go on the news. She didn't post online. She didn't call a press conference. She went back to her rented apartment, sat down with a cup of black coffee, and opened the case log she'd been handed that morning. 3 pages, nearly blank. The incident report for Malik Bell said only this: subject was non-compliant, D99 protocol initiated, legal guardian unreachable. That code, D99, appeared familiar. Jasmine ran it through her archives. She'd seen it in 5 other cases over the last 8 years, all of them involving Black or Latino minors. All of them marked internally handled. None of them had defense counsel. 2 of them had ended in injury, 1 in death. And in each case, the arresting officer? Dana Whitmore. The code wasn't about safety, it was a label for quiet removal. It wasn't criminal procedure, it was legal disappearance. Jasmine didn't say anything that night. She just circled the code and wrote in the margin, pattern detected, start pulling threads. At exactly 10:43 p.m., Jasmine Crockett heard a soft shuffle outside her apartment door. She lived in a modest 3rd-floor walk-up off Jefferson Boulevard. Quiet, unremarkable, chosen precisely because it wasn't supposed to attract attention. When she opened the door, there was no one in the hallway, but on the floor was a plain manila envelope. No stamp, no name, taped shut with what looked like ordinary office tape. Inside were 7 printed pages. No introduction, no cover sheet, just data, rows of arrest records, timestamps, and a list of student initials marked with one repeated code, D99. Her heart slowed as she read. She had seen the designation before in Malik Bell's file, but now it was everywhere. 14 students, all under 17, all arrested under nonviolent preemptive action. Each file marked guardian unreachable or counsel not required, and each one initiated by officers reporting to Lieutenant Dana Whitmore. There was something else. Each record had been filed, not through standard channels, but through a back-end internal system Jasmine hadn't seen since her days in juvenile advocacy. A side portal known only to a handful of court clerks and police liaisons, used primarily for sensitive detentions, most commonly those involving at-risk foster youth or undocumented minors. But these kids, they had families, schools, lives. They weren't ghosts. Someone had made them invisible on purpose. At the bottom of the last page was a handwritten note in clean block letters. I can't speak, but I can still leave the door open. M. Jasmine folded the paper slowly. Whoever this person was, they were risking their job, maybe more. Leaking internal data, even to a state legislator, could carry serious legal consequences, which meant this wasn't just a concerned staffer. This was someone inside the machine who had seen too much and had finally had enough. The next day, Jasmine made a quiet visit to the courthouse archives. She didn't walk through the front lobby. She went through the staff entrance, carrying a worn leather folio and wearing a long coat. She wasn't hiding, she just didn't want questions. At the records window sat a thin man with sharp cheekbones, glasses slightly crooked on one ear. He wore a faded name tag, Row M. His eyes met hers for only half a second, but that was enough. She slid him a request form folded around one of the printed D99 pages. He read it, didn't flinch, then quietly said, "Back room, 5 minutes." Jasmine waited by the vending machines. When Rowe returned, he handed her a USB flash drive. It was wrapped in a brown paper napkin. No words. She nodded, turned, and walked out. Back in her office that evening, Jasmine opened the drive. Inside were 4 folders. Arrest logs, D99, tagged supervisor routing. Charts, legal waiver anomalies, body cam index, missing dates. Each folder contained records that shouldn't exist, or at least should never have been accessible without a court order. But here they were. The most damning piece was a single spreadsheet, rows of juvenile arrest records, cross-referenced with a column labeled Outcome Risk Level, Internal Use Only. Next to Malik Bell's name, Low Threat, High Potential Disruption. Beneath that, D99 pre-flag confirmed, no escalation needed if handled quietly. It wasn't policing, it was profiling, and not based on crime, but on behavioral forecasts, many pulled from school conduct notes, social media scans, and AI-driven watch lists. In other words, kids were being arrested, flagged, and hidden, not because of what they'd done, but because of what someone thought they might do someday. Jasmine leaned back in her chair. She remembered a quote she once read, scribbled on the back of an old civil rights pamphlet. "The system doesn't fear those who shout. It fears those who stare too long without blinking." She wasn't shouting, not yet, but she was staring. And now she had names, records, patterns, and a silent ally named M. It was time to trace the architecture, because codes don't create themselves. People do. The numbers didn't lie. Jasmine had spent 2 full nights studying the files. Not as a legislator, but as a former civil rights attorney trained to look not for what was present, but for what was missing. What stood out was not just the repetition of D99 across student files. It was how predictably clean everything looked. Too clean. Identical language. Phrases like subject presented signs of non-compliance or recommended precautionary detainment based on cumulative behavior index showed up across completely unrelated cases from different schools, months apart. She'd seen this before. It wasn't narrative, it was template. Something produced not by human recollection, but by a system designed to self-protect. And then came the funding data. Buried deep inside the supervisor routing charts folder was a set of internal budget transfers. These weren't public documents. They came from a shadow layer of operational funding marked as Adaptive Public Safety Alignment under a program called the Community Stability Partnership. Each time a D99 tagged student was detained, Jasmine noticed, a corresponding entry appeared in the budget sheets within 5 to 7 days. Always under one category, Rapid Response Credit, code A73. The more D99s were issued in a given area, the more credits that zone received. And credits meant money. More specifically, state disbursements to certain stability districts tied to school police cooperation. Those credits could be applied toward equipment, training, and in some cases, redevelopment projects. That's when Jasmine circled back to something she'd nearly overlooked: the addresses. Of the 14 students listed in the whistleblower files, 11 lived in neighborhoods currently under early phase redevelopment reviews. It hit her like a cold gust of wind through a cracked window. These children weren't just flagged. They were being cleared, not arrested because they posed harm, but because they complicated property value projections. Jasmine knew the signs. She had seen it in other cities, communities labeled the unstable on paper, which then triggered increased patrols, more arrests, and eventual displacement. A formula that sounded like policy but functioned like quiet removal. And now, in Dallas, it had a new name: D999. She opened a map and began pinning red dots for each student. Then she overlaid the city's redevelopment plans, zoning adjustments, housing demolitions, and school restructuring measures. They matched almost perfectly. In less than 2 hours, she had connected the dots: a behavioral flagging system, a financial incentive stream, a law enforcement unit given broad discretion, and a quiet erasure of presence before the public even noticed who was missing. Jasmine leaned back in her chair. She rubbed her eyes, the weariness not from lack of sleep, but from knowing exactly what she was looking at. This wasn't misconduct. This was architecture. And every system has an architect. That's when she remembered a name from years ago: Colton Reed, now Deputy Director of Urban Security Initiatives. formerly a policy advisor on juvenile justice. She had debated Reed on a local news show once back when she was still a practicing attorney. He'd argued in favor of predictive public safety frameworks. She had countered that predicting behavior based on race, income, or geography wasn't policing. It was discrimination. He'd smiled and said, "You call it bias, I call it preparation." Now she opened the project charter of the Community Stability Partnership, the umbrella under which all those D99 budget disbursements were filed. At the bottom of the third page, Program Consultant, C. Reed. There he was. Jasmine's mind moved quickly. If Reed was involved in the creation of this system, then somewhere there would be policy memos, drafts, emails, something that showed intent. She picked up her phone and dialed someone she hadn't spoken to in over a year. "Elise," she said when the voice answered, "I need you to help me get into the old zoning board minutes in Budget Council archives. Years 2018 to 22. There was a pause on the other end. "You think this thing goes back that far?" Elise asked. "I think," Jasmine said, "this thing was built to last." 2 days later, Elise delivered a flash drive in person. On it were internal city council recordings, including a private briefing between Reed and a group of redevelopment investors. The language was coded, polished, but unmistakable. In one audio clip, Reed said, "We can't afford hesitation in these buffer zones. We need deterrence before displacement. The markers help us prioritize risk before it becomes unrest." Jasmine played that line 3 times. Markers, deterrence, erfass, buffer zones. It wasn't just a system of control, it was a system of pre-clearing resistance. And children, black, brown, poor, were being used as evidence to justify the stabilization of entire communities. The erasure wasn't accidental, it was strategic. That night, Jasmine sat at her desk long after midnight. The map on her wall was now covered in red threads and taped screenshots. Across the top, in black marker, she'd written a single question. Who benefits when a child disappears quietly? She didn't know all the names yet, but she knew this. She had enough to go public, enough to demand hearings, enough to make the silence break wide open. And somewhere, someone else, the whistleblower, was probably watching. So she pulled a sticky note from her drawer, wrote a message, and stuck it to the top of her wall map. "You left the door open. Now I'm walking through it." Jasmine didn't start with a press conference. She knew better. This wasn't the kind of truth that could survive a soundbite or be squeezed into a headline between stories about gas prices and school board meetings. What she had wasn't a scandal. It was a structure. And people don't fear structures, not until you show them how it moves. So she began the way all deliberate truth-tellers do, by letting others listen first. She booked a small community center on the edge of Fair Park, an old red brick building that once served as a neighborhood polling place before the city budget quietly let it rot. She brought no media, no signage, and no podium. Just a projector, a folding table, and 30 chairs. Her invitation list included public school teachers, housing advocates, legal aid volunteers, and a handful of concerned parents she had met during her years of community work. The title of the meeting was printed in plain Times New Roman across a white sheet of paper taped to the door. Understanding the Invisible File. When the attendees arrived, Jasmine greeted each one personally. No notes in hand, no printed talking points, just calm eye contact and a nod. Once they were seated, she stepped forward and clicked the projector on. A gray screen filled the wall. She didn't speak right away. Instead, she clicked on the first slide. The juvenile intake file for Malik Bell. There were no names displayed, just a blurry intake photo, timestamps, and fields labeled non-compliant and D99 processed. Then she clicked to another, then another. By the 5th slide, murmurs began to rise. A teacher raised her hand. "Why do they all say the same thing?" Jasmine looked at her. "Because it's not a report, it's a script." She explained the D99 protocol, what it was, what it did, and how it functioned, not as a legal charge, but a categorical dismissal of presence. She showed them maps, budget lines, timelines that connected redevelopment funding with the frequency of arrests. And then, she did something no one expected. She stopped talking. The screen behind her now displayed a single question. What did you see, but never realize? One by one, people in the room began to speak. A school counselor recalled a 13-year-old girl who was removed from campus after a behavioral note that simply read, frequent silence and eye avoidance. A housing coordinator mentioned how new patrol units began circling apartments right before city inspections. One mother said quietly, "My son was arrested for loitering in front of the library. They said he matched a predictive profile. I didn't even know that was a thing." Jasmine didn't guide them. She didn't tell them what to believe. She just let the evidence and the familiarity do the work. By the end of the evening, they weren't asking if it was real. They were asking how far it reached. The next step was riskier. Jasmine contacted a former colleague, Marisol Vega, now head of content at a small but respected independent media outlet in Texas. She didn't give her the whole file, just one case, one boy, one intake form, one body cam log with an unexplained 3-minute blackout, and one map showing the property value of his block spiking just 2 months after his removal. Marisol read it twice, then said, "We'll publish, but only if we can do it long form, no splashy headline." Jasmine agreed. The article, released 3 days later under the headline "Disappeared by Design," told the story of Malik Bell in careful, exacting detail. There were no accusations, just verifiable facts. What stunned readers wasn't the act. It was the coldness of the language. Subject flagged for high disruption probability. Guardian unreachable, proceeding under silent protocol. Compliance established through quiet detainment. By the end of the article, readers were asking questions Jasmine had been asking for weeks. Who writes like that? Who decides who becomes silent? And most importantly, how many other children never made it into the story? The first wave of reaction was small but sharp. A city council member quietly called Jasmine's office, asking if they could meet off-record. A middle school principal emailed asking if he could see if any of his students were in the system. But not everyone was grateful. Within 48 hours, Jasmine received a formal letter from the Dallas Public Safety Office, stating that her use of unauthorized juvenile records may constitute a breach of information handling statutes. A veiled warning. That same night, an unmarked SUV parked outside her apartment building for over 2 hours. Engine off, no driver visible. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't call it in. She just logged the date, the time, and the license plate, partial though it was, into a paper journal. Next to it, she wrote, "If they're watching, they know I'm not done yet." She launched the second phase quietly by reaching out to community libraries. She offered to run civic literacy sessions, open to the public, free, no RSVP, one topic only: what your child's school record doesn't show. The first session drew 7 people. The third drew 20. By the 5th, the room was full, and every parent in that room had a story, and Jasmine let them talk. Because truth doesn't spread by force, it spreads by recognition. The final slide in her deck was always the same. No data, no charts, just a sentence, white on black. If you don't know the code, you become it. And then silence, because that silence now belonged to everyone in the room. The first blow came in a headline: local legislator accused of misusing juvenile data in political campaign. No source, no evidence, just 5 short paragraphs from a well-funded suburban daily that rarely covered inner-city education or public safety. But the headline did its job. By noon, 3 more outlets had picked it up. The story grew arms and legs. Whistleblower or reckless advocate? Did Rep. Jasmine Crockett overstep? Is there a hidden agenda behind the D99 narrative? The news cycle didn't need answers. It only needed suspicion. Jasmine wasn't surprised. She'd seen it before. When truth hit close to the center, the counterattack didn't come from inside the courtroom. It came from behind the curtain in the form of misdirection and shadowed language. That same evening, she received a letter from the Texas Department of Information Oversight. The tone was calm, the wording bureaucratic. This office has received an inquiry regarding potential mishandling of protected case material not released through standard judicial channels. The letter didn't accuse her of anything outright. It merely requested clarification. But Jasmine knew what it was: an early-stage soft muzzle, a method to slow her down through paperwork, uncertainty, and internal reviews. Still, what rattled her wasn't the bureaucracy, it was the people. Within 2 days of the article going live, the tone in her inbox shifted. Where there had been gratitude, there was now hesitation. Where teachers had asked for more documents, now they asked, "Is this safe? Should I be involved?" Parents, once eager to share, now canceled meetings. And then came the school district memo, officially titled Clarification of Legal Risk Associated with Data-Based Advocacy. It was quietly circulated among district principals, instructing staff to refrain from participating in off-campus, non-certified sessions related to data justice, particularly those that may involve minors or non-public information. It never named Jasmine, but it didn't have to. She had been soft-shadowed, defined not as wrong but as possibly dangerous, suspicious, overreaching, and once again, the burden was on her to prove she wasn't. Elise, her legal advisor, sat across from her kitchen table as the noise grew. "We have 2 options," she said plainly. "Fight the accusation or turn it back around." "You mean sue?" Jasmine asked. "No," Elise replied. "I mean flip the frame. If they want to question your authority, make the public question their motives." Jasmine didn't answer right away. Her fingers drummed lightly on the edge of her tea mug. "They're not attacking me," she said finally. "They're attacking belief. If they can convince people that I'm tainted, the whole movement slows." "Then show them why it started in the first place," Elise said. "Not with systems, with faces." That night, Jasmine reopened a folder on her desktop. Inside were letters, drawings, notes from the families she had met in her sessions. One in particular stopped her. A boy's handwriting, uneven in all caps. "I'm still here, even if they forgot me." She looked at that line a long time. Then she made her decision. 2 days later, Jasmine went live, not through press, not on TV, just a plain, quiet YouTube stream titled Why I Spoke. No lighting crew, no lawyer at her side. Just a webcam, a wall behind her filled with case file labels, and one wooden chair. She didn't lead with defense. She led with names. Malik, Kendra, Isaiah, 12 others whose stories I can't yet tell because the system erased them before we could ask why. She walked the audience through a single intake report. She highlighted the words, subject uncooperative, guardian unreachable, no legal representation required. Then she stared directly into the camera and said, "If telling the truth about this makes me dangerous, then ask yourself, dangerous to whom?" The video gained traction slowly, then suddenly. By morning, it had over 70,000 views. By the next evening, it had 500,000, and the comments section began to shift. We knew something was off. That language doesn't sound like protection. It sounds like prediction. Even if she's under fire, the files are real, and we need answers. Jasmine didn't speak again for 48 hours. She didn't need to. The momentum was returning, not because she silenced the backlash, but because she refused to let them silence the truth. It started with a message, no subject line, sent from an email address Jasmine didn't recognize. But the words were impossible to ignore. My son was D99 in 2019. We never knew the term until we read the article, but now I understand why they never let us see the intake report. I want to speak. The next day, another email arrived, then 3 more. By week's end, Jasmine had a folder titled Voices Pending with 41 names. Parents, guardians, 2 students who were now old enough to speak for themselves. They didn't want money, they didn't want lawsuits. They just wanted people to know what had been done to them, not in secret, but in silence. It wasn't about exposure anymore. It was about reclamation. Jasmine held the first roundtable on a Sunday afternoon in the basement of a local nonprofit. No cameras, no reporters, just folding chairs, coffee, and a big sign taped to the wall. We were never the problem. There were 13 attendees that day. Not one had ever filed a formal complaint. Some had tried, but were told their window for objection had closed. Others had been told there was nothing unusual at all, just standard behavior, intervention, standard juvenile protocol. But the words they heard back then were very different from the words they were learning now. He was isolated for 36 hours. They said I couldn't come because it wasn't a formal charge. She was told her future depended on cooperating quietly. We asked for a lawyer. They said it wasn't that kind of arrest. At the far end of the table sat a quiet young man, tall and broad-shouldered. His name was Trey Fields, 18 now. But when he'd been detained, he was 15 and still small enough to wear his cousin's hand-me-down shoes. When his turn came to speak, he simply said, "They made it sound like I was lucky they didn't charge me." Then he pulled out a folded piece of paper, the only record he was ever given. It was blank except for a time, a code, and the words, "Compliance logged, no further action." "That wasn't my freedom," Trey said. "That was my disappearance." Nobody clapped, but nobody looked away either. Word spread fast, not through news feeds, but through kitchen tables, church meetings, school hallways. A mother told another mother. A teacher whispered to a colleague. By early spring, Jasmine had collected stories from over 60 families across 3 counties. She compiled their statements not in a legal filing, but in something simpler and more powerful. A testimony ledger, 27 pages long, one entry for each D99 tagged case. It was not notarized, not signed by lawyers, not edited by a PR team. It was simply this, a page for each person, their name, their age at the time of detainment, one paragraph describing what they remember, one sentence they wanted the public to hear. Some wrote in capital letters, others in cursive, some in Spanish, some in fragments. Some ended with tears, but every page carried the same weight. I exist. I was there. You cannot erase me. The moment the stories reached critical mass came unexpectedly. A high school civics teacher, one who had quietly attended Jasmine's earliest library sessions, assigned her students a research project on how public records shape perception. Instead of using textbook cases, he gave them access to Jasmine's ledger. The students read, they annotated, and one student, 17-year-old Danielle Miles, decided to present her findings not as a paper, but as a spoken word piece. She posted a video of herself reading part of Trey Fields' statement aloud in front of her school mural. In 90 seconds, her voice cracked. They said he matched the profile. They said they had no choice. But nobody ever asked what it cost to be silenced so young. The video was reposted 300,000 times in a weekend. Jasmine didn't even know about it until a local reporter called and asked, "Did you authorize the student campaign?" She smiled. "I didn't start it," she said. "They did." That week, something changed in the city. People stopped calling it Jasmine's movement. They started calling it the pushback. Soon after, a parent group requested a special audience with the school board. Not to file a complaint, but to present the ledger. They handed out printed copies. One board member refused to take it, citing potential legal implications. But the other 6 read it. One of them, a formerly reserved board chair, stared at page 18 for several minutes. Then she said, "We've been measuring school safety by absence. Maybe we should have been asking who's missing." When Jasmine held her next community session, the format had changed. This time, she didn't speak at all. She sat in the back row as others stood at the front. Trey, Danielle, a mother named Inez who'd never told her story aloud before. They didn't speak like victims. They spoke like historians, reconstructing what had been buried, redacted, or spun. By the end, someone had placed a sign on the podium. It read, "This space is not for the voiceless, it's for those who were told to shut up." The names had returned, and now that they had, there was no going back. The stories had done their job. Now it was time for the paper trail to speak. Jasmine sat in the Jefferson Community Law Room, surrounded by cardboard folders, USB drives, yellowed planning documents, and a massive wall diagram that had grown like a nervous system across the east wall. Names, departments, contract codes, arrows marked who signed what, and dates circled in red. At the center was a single word written in thick black marker. D99 wasn't a mistake. It was a mechanism. She had known it for weeks, but now she could prove it. With the help of Elise and a small group of legal researchers, Jasmine had pieced together a full model of how the system had been created, not just how it was used. And at every layer, the same pattern emerged. Classification language written by legal consultants, policy integration funded through redevelopment budgets, implementation signed off by urban security officials. But the real key came from a recently retired school district official who'd shown up to one of Jasmine's events with a plain brown envelope and one sentence: "I saw what they buried. This is the part they never thought anyone would look for." Inside were scanned pages of internal meeting minutes, drafts of policy changes proposed in 2017 by something called the Youth Risk Stabilization Committee. At first glance, the name sounded like a mental health initiative, but the meeting summaries told a darker story. Each session referenced flagging protocols, neighborhood heat mapping, and most chillingly, silent intervention thresholds for high-disruption youth before formal complaint metrics are triggered. Jasmine leaned forward and read that line again. Before formal complaint metrics. That meant these children weren't just targeted. They were interrupted, preemptively, and then denied recourse by design. Each draft included signatures. Each signature led to a name, and one of those names stopped her cold. Colton Reed, former Deputy Director of Juvenile Justice Policy, current position, Executive Advisor to the Office of Urban Redevelopment. She remembered him well. 5 years ago, Reed had defended predictive policing on live television, calmly saying, "We're not targeting youth, we're mitigating outcomes." Now Jasmine had the minutes showing he had helped craft the very wording used in D99 reports. It wasn't just semantics, it was legal insulation, designed to bypass public reporting, crafted to survive lawsuits, built to survive exposure. Not anymore. The second breakthrough came from the money trail. A graduate student from UT Dallas, working quietly on Jasmine's team, had gone line by line through 4 years of community security enhancement funds, a state-level pool used to support urban safety innovation. What she found was damning. Buried inside the fund were line items labeled Flexible Youth Oversight Programming, routed through third-party nonprofits. Each disbursement aligned with zip codes where D99 usage spiked, and each report was signed off by a rotating subcommittee that answered to only one office, the Urban Redevelopment Oversight Board, and sitting as chair for 3 of the 4 years, Reed. That wasn't oversight, it was ownership. The time had come. Jasmine and Elise prepared a public dossier. It included minutes from the Youth Risk Stabilization Committee, policy drafts showing how D99 was inserted into school discipline guidance, a list of all approval signatures, a map correlating redevelopment funding to school detainment frequency, a timeline of Reed's roles, actions, and voting records across departments. The title was simple: the D99 Framework, Design, Deployment, Disappearance. On the final page was a single sentence: this system was not failed oversight, it was engineered abandonment. Jasmine didn't hold a press conference. She held a public presentation, streamed live, recorded plainly, hosted in the same community room where the first stories had been told. But this time she brought names. She didn't shout, she didn't speculate. She showed how policy had been weaponized. She played audio of Reed during a closed 2018 session, saying, "We can't legislate every troubled child, but we can keep them from becoming obstacles." And she let that line hang. Then she clicked to the next slide, a D99 intake form stamped "No action needed," a name, an age, a file number. No lawyer, no process, just silence. After the live stream, everything changed. Local outlets who'd stayed neutral began investigating the Urban Redevelopment Oversight Board. A state senator called for an independent audit of youth detainment practices in Dallas County. The Texas Civil Rights Commission requested access to Jasmine's full dossier, and within 72 hours, Reed released a statement. It read like damage control. "While I've always worked to promote safe communities, I acknowledge that past initiatives may not have anticipated the complexities of juvenile enforcement. No denial, no apology, just strategic retreat. But the curtain had already been pulled, and what was behind it wasn't just corruption, it was design." A week later, Jasmine received a quiet message from a reporter in Austin. "Sources tell me Reed's stepping down before the next budget cycle. He's calling it a health-related decision. Thought you'd want to know." Jasmine stared at the message. Then she turned to her whiteboard and erased one name from the center. She didn't celebrate, because Reed wasn't the whole machine. But he had been the architect, and now, thanks to the names that pushed back, his blueprint was finally public. When systems fall, it rarely starts with a bang. They crumble with paper. Budgets recalled, contracts revoked, emails reread. People sighed answering questions they have long pretended never to hear. And in April, it began. The Texas State Oversight Committee called an emergency session, citing mounting concerns over juvenile classification policies and potential misuse of redevelopment-linked enforcement protocols. No one used the words D99 at first, but everyone knew what they were talking about. Jasmine didn't speak at the session. She didn't have to. Her name was now part of the record, entered by multiple lawmakers who quoted directly from the D99 dossier. One representative, formerly cautious, stood and read from page 47. If a student can be removed from learning space without a parent, without a lawyer, without charges, and we fund it with redevelopment cash, then what exactly are we building? Because it sure as hell isn't justice. The room didn't cheer, but no one looked away. What came next wasn't drama, it was mechanism failure. Within 3 weeks, 4 urban redevelopment contracts were frozen pending ethics review. The Youth Risk Stabilization Committee was disbanded. All public schools in Dallas County were instructed to suspend D99-related interventions. That last part felt like progress. But to Jasmine, it wasn't a win, it was a pause. Suspension just means they're hiding the knife, she told Elise. We have to make sure they don't sharpen it later. So while the government scrambled, Jasmine and her growing coalition tightened the story. They launched a public website. Clean, simple, plain colors. Title, 27 pages. Each page told one story from a D99 victim or family. One voice, one set of facts, no ads, no hashtags, no donations requested, just raw, unedited truth. The site went live on a Monday. By Friday, it had been visited 2.3 million times. Then came the ripple effect. Counties beyond Dallas, Tarrant, Harris, Travis, started digging into their own juvenile records. A school counselor from San Antonio called Jasmine's office and said, I think we've been using the same codes under a different label. I'm sending over what I found. But tell me this, what do I say to the kids I flagged? Jasmine didn't have an answer, because accountability didn't mean fixing the past. It meant not letting it repeat. The turning point arrived the day a whistleblower from the Texas Education Coordination Board sent a flash drive to Jasmine's legal team. No return address, no explanation, just one line on a Post-it note. It goes deeper than you think. Start with Learning Compliance Index. Elise opened the drive and found an internal research program funded through federal pilot grants. Its purpose? To test preemptive learning environment optimization in Title I schools. The key metric? Behavioral non-alignment scores. Children weren't being disciplined. They were being cataloged based on body language, verbal silence, facial tension. If the scores passed a threshold, the child was flagged, not for punishment, but for resource reallocation, which in over 60% of cases meant removal from standard instruction. And who signed off on the pilot program? Colton Reed, again, only this time he wasn't acting alone. Attached were meeting logs showing coordination between school district tech advisors, private ed tech contractors, and a national consultancy that once helped digitize correctional forecasting systems. Jasmine read the names slowly. Then she wrote a single sentence on the whiteboard. They weren't predicting behavior, they were eliminating risk. But the risk wasn't violence, it was visibility. She called a press briefing, not to respond, but to reveal. Standing at a wooden podium outside the Jefferson Law Room, flanked by parents and students, she held up a single intake form. This is what they called optimization. This is what they called early intervention. This is what they called safe. She flipped the page. This was a boy removed without a fight, without a lawyer, without a record. Then she looked out at the crowd. And this is what I call a system that built its own shadow. We didn't break it, we just turned on the light. That evening, 3 more state agencies requested internal reviews. A civil rights group in New Mexico called Jasmine for help interpreting similar classifications showing up in their juvenile data. By May, 14 school districts across 5 states had launched policy reviews. But even as the structure cracked, Jasmine refused to call it a victory, because the harm had already happened. There were still names to find, still records redacted, still youth who'd walked through those school gates one morning and disappeared by nightfall. She turned to Trey Fields, now working part-time at the community law room, and asked, "What do we do next?" He didn't hesitate. "We write down the ones they missed." They began collecting anonymous tips. People sent photos, scans, copies of school memos from 2016-2018. Some scribbled notes from teachers, all centered around children who never had a file, but left no footprint after intervention. Jasmine began a new whiteboard, the unknowns. It wasn't legal work. It wasn't policy work. It was memory work. Because systems fall, yes. But what matters more is what rises after. And Jasmine Crockett didn't build a campaign. She built a way to remember what power tried to forget. It started with a cardboard box. A father from Oak Cliff had kept it in his garage for 4 years, stuffed with papers, a worn hoodie, a teacher's note that said, "He was disruptive again today." Removed to resource. No full report, no file number, just silence. His son, Amari, had been sent to an alternative learning environment at 13. No charges, no notice, no explanation, other than intervention required. He never went back to school. Now 19, Amari worked night shifts at a convenience store and hadn't spoken about it again. But his father had saved the box, and he brought it to Jasmine's office and said, "I know he ain't on your list of 27, but he should have been." Jasmine opened the box and pulled out the note. That was the moment she knew the work had to shift again. They'd uncovered the mechanism. They'd exposed the architects. Now they had to preserve the aftermath. The idea took root quickly, an archive of the forgotten, a space where families could send any record, artifact, or memory related to juvenile intervention that had no formal file, not to be analyzed, not to be filed in court, to be remembered. Because if the system had no place for them, Jasmine would build one. They rented space in an old brick building that once served as a records office. Fitting, Jasmine thought. Volunteers cleaned it out, brought in shelves, hung whiteboards, labeled boxes by year, zip code, or category. Non-detained but disappeared. Removed to resource. No guardian contacted. Unfiled transfers. People started bringing manila folders, drawings, voice memos from students who said, "I was sent away, but I never knew why." Some submitted anonymously. Others walked in with tears in their eyes and said, "I just want someone to see this." By midsummer, the archive held over 300 cases, not officially documented, but corroborated through emails, school logs, or parental statements. These were the children who had slipped between the cracks so completely, the system no longer remembered their names. But now someone did. Trey Fields, now working full-time at the archive, created a digital catalog. No flashy site, no login required, just a public listing. These children were once categorized as disruptive. These families were told nothing was wrong. This is their record now. At the top of the site was a phrase Jasmine had written on a post-it: "You can't reform what you refuse to remember." The archive didn't go unnoticed. A civil rights lawyer from Chicago flew in to see it. She left quietly, but 2 weeks later, a bill was introduced in the Illinois State House to mandate juvenile classification transparency in all public schools. A reporter from ProPublica ran a profile titled, "The Building Where America's Lost Youth Are Being Remembered." A U.S. senator called Jasmine and said, "If this is happening here, you know it's happening elsewhere. What do you want from Washington?" She didn't hesitate. Recognition and protection, not for me, for the records you don't yet know exist. The archive became more than a ledger. It became a map. They began connecting the patterns, similar phrases, identical codes, template language reused in different states, out-of-date teacher handbooks referencing Tier 3 removal, notes that said, "Child redirected off campus," with no paperwork. A group of law students helped link the patterns into a national framework. One student looked up from her laptop and said, "We're not documenting trauma, we're documenting design." Jasmine knew the next step wouldn't be local. It had to be federal. So she and Elise, along with a coalition of legal experts in affected families, drafted the Juvenile Classification Oversight and Memory Act, a proposal for a federal ban on undocumented educational removals, mandatory parental notification within 2 hours of any school-based detainment or redirection, a national registry of any student action resulting in removal from standard instruction without legal or medical cause, grants for states to establish their own archives of forgotten youth. They didn't introduce it through back channels. They read it aloud on Capitol Hill. And not by Jasmine, by Trey Fields. Standing in a pressed white shirt with the archives seal behind him, Trey's voice was calm, but steady. I was D99'd without knowing what that meant. I disappeared without anyone saying my name. This law won't undo what happened, but it will keep someone else from being made to vanish quietly. In the room, 2 Congress members wept. One later admitted, that bill wouldn't have passed committee 6 months ago, but now people are watching. Jasmine didn't expect applause. She didn't expect the bill to pass immediately. She just wanted it on the record, to prove that when people say we didn't know, they can no longer mean it. Because now the archive exists. Now the names are public. Now the children once forgotten are visible. And visibility is where systems start to change. On the archive's first anniversary, Jasmine stood alone in the record room, running her fingers along the spine of one file labeled AM13, sent to resource, no call home. She whispered quietly, "You matter. I'm sorry it took this long, but we're not silent anymore." She didn't cry. She didn't have to, because outside, down the hall, the next shift of volunteers was arriving. Each of them once a whisper in a crowded room. Now, they were the ones building history, one file at a time. The hearing room in Washington felt like a courthouse and a confessional at once. Jasmine sat in the second row, not at the table. She had chosen not to speak this time. Let the records do the talking. Over the past year, her team had gathered over 700 names, children lost in paperwork, removed from schools, families gaslit into silence. They were no longer ghosts. They had dates, descriptions, and now they had a bill on the floor. The Juvenile Classification Oversight and Memory Act, once considered too ambitious, now sat squarely before Congress. They called one more witness. He wasn't an expert. He was a young man in his 20s, dressed in a plain blue shirt, a file in his lap, trembling slightly. "My name is Curtis Boone," he said. "I was flagged at 14. I didn't know why. One day I was just pulled from class and sent to a place with gray walls and no explanation. I stayed there 6 months. My mom thought it was something I did. I thought maybe I deserved it." He looked at Jasmine, then back at the room. "You all keep calling it a system failure, but it didn't fail. It worked the way someone built it. I'm just asking you, don't let them build it again." The silence afterward was not procedural. It was sacred. That afternoon, the committee voted, and for the first time in U.S. history, a federal body acknowledged that juvenile data systems had been used to erase, not protect. The bill passed the committee. Within months, states began adopting it. Schools were required to notify parents within 2 hours of removal. All behavior-based reassignments had to be logged and reviewed. And for the first time, memory was not optional. Jasmine declined every interview request. Instead, she expanded the archive. "I want to be more than a warning on a spreadsheet." And Jasmine nodded, because that's how justice begins. Not with a verdict, but with a voice once dismissed, now heard in full. If you're reading this and you're over 50, you've seen America change. You remember the headlines, the marches, the policies that promised fairness and fell short. You know what it means to fight for decency, quietly, steadily, sometimes when no one else is watching. This story may be fiction, but the truth inside it is real. Children are still being labeled, redirected, erased, sometimes not by cruelty, but by indifference masked as order. If you've ever wondered, what can I still do? Here it is. Ask your school board what protections exist for all students, not just the easy ones. Support policies that make systems transparent, not just efficient. Talk to your grandchildren. Ask them if they feel seen, not just measured. And most of all, Vote for people who treat memory like justice, not inconvenience. Because silence isn't peace, and visibility isn't chaos. Justice is what happens when ordinary people refuse to forget. Let that be your legacy, not just what you stood for, but who you stood with. We are no longer silent, and we're glad you're still here to speak with us.